You know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. We pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown. You know, I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. We would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities, see what was going on. Yeah. Now, whatever that comes from, I don't know, but it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life, so that was an escape. Oh, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Floaties for Krakens, Season 2, Episode 2. Welcome. I'm so excited. Hi. Welcome to another episode in which you can see me. And we're on video. How exciting. I wasn't sure if I should still keep doing these intros, but I think they're helpful, right? And I don't know, it's nice to kind of put all my thoughts together and into one cohesive, this is what you're in for. Also, do like my new microphone. For those of you who are listening and can't see, it's obnoxious. Just like me. It's pink and fuzzy. So, yeah, hopefully you can hear me better. I'm still playing with levels, but oh well. Anyway, today's episode is so special and so near and dear to my heart. It's featuring somebody who kind of sparked the interest of not only storytelling, but being scary with your storytelling and pushing those boundaries of comfortability in your storytelling, because that's who we as human beings are. And I'm so darn excited to introduce you all to the selfless, unbelievably kind, just angel of a human being, Dr. Ben Pyle. In his words, okay, Dr. Ben Pyle is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama, where he also serves as the director of Alabama Forensics. Shout out, love you guys. You all are always incredible. Also, our graphic designer, Natalie Hedberg, coaches there too, so extra shout out. In addition to research, Ben writes prose, comics, and graphic novels, and I will link every single one of those in the description below. I don't even know where to begin. I met Ben, in 2015 for the first time. I was a transfer student going to Western Kentucky University. It was my first time stepping foot in a four-year institution. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was my first day of school, and I was unbelievably terrified and scared, and I didn't know what was going on, and I was alone. I was very far away from home. Just felt very clueless, lost, scared. I I don't know. My self-esteem was like a freaking pickle. I don't know. It was rough, okay? And I remember on the first day of school, I had my very first session ever um, with Ben. And I was literally rushing up the hill of the university. I was sweating. I was probably crying every day, and malnourished, not drinking enough water. Just everything was wrong. I was confused. I was lost. And I was really scared and really intimidated because I really wanted to do so well, um, working with Ben. And what I mean by coaching, right, is he was my speech and debate coach at Western Kentucky. And I just really wanted to make a good first impression. And I was so scared. I hadn't seen any of the other coaches yet, but Ben was my first session. And so I ran over there and I like barged open his door and I was like, "Hello, I'm Camille." And then like I threw my backpack down, got my black book, which is what we use to perform, and I just was about to start. Like tears, sweat, just everything happening. And Ben goes, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait, hold on. Take a breath. Take a seat. Drink some water. How are you feeling today?" And I was stunned. I was like, "What? How am I feeling today? Like, you care about how I'm feeling today?" And it has stuck with me ever since that a teacher would see me, Camille, before seeing a statistic or a name on a roster or a performance skill, right? It was a person seeing me for me and all that I had to offer as a human being first before being a student. And it sticks with me to this day. I make it a point in the past when I was a teacher, in the future if I ever become a teacher again, to make sure that my students know that their worth is everything, their self-worth is everything. Checking in on each other, mindfulness is so validating and so important. And a question as seemingly small as "How are you feeling today?" can change your life. Thanks, Ben, for everything. Thank you for nurturing a very scared, lost soul. Thank you for creating such a safe place where not only myself, but so many other people felt so safe exploring stories and complicated stories and difficult narratives with. Gosh, if you ever have the privilege of having a teacher like a Ben, or if you've had the privilege of learning from the guy, it's I can't even I can't even put it into words without getting emotional. Ben, thank you so much for letting me be me and letting me be scary, and you're literally changing the world one how do you feel at a time. Thanks, Ben. All right. Yeah. Well, ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you how do you feels for Hulks.
Yay.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Camille.
How are you?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm alive.
Good.
That's I think a start, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Oh, I am too. I've been a big fan of your show. I'm well, just you as a person too for years now. But
Oh, Ben.
thanks for having me.
For people that may not know, me and Ben go way back. to my undergraduate years. Yeah, at Western Kentucky University. Ben was one of my coaches on the forensics team. Oh my God. But like so much more than a coach. I mean, obviously, as a coach, he was brilliant, but. And I always tell people this, and I'm going to make you really embarrassed now, Ben, and I apologize. But every time, literally, and I've always been wanting to tell you this, every time people ask me, who are one of your favorite teachers, like ever, I always say Ben, and they say why. And I say because, like, and I still remember this very vividly. One of the first sessions I ever had with you, I was very nervous. I was scared. I was like, oh my God, Western Kentucky, this is like a big deal. And I remember going in and like just immediately trying to start like with my book in hand. And you were like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And I was like, oh, okay. Like this, I guess I can answer that question. How am I today? And it's always stuck like just so deep with me, Ben, that you saw me as a person first, and I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much. And geez, you're trying to get me to cry here first thing. I'm not going to be able to. What are you blubbering through this episode?
I'm sorry. I just had to say I haven't seen you for a while.
I haven't seen you. Thank you so much. And you were always so wonderful. I continually use you as an example with my students to this day. Just reminder of just how good of a person you are. I mean, of course, we also reference your brilliant performances and how talented you are. But every time that your name comes up with any of my colleagues, they just always talk about how wonderful of a person you are. And for me, that always makes me the proudest when I'm like, oh my gosh, what a great person.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a true joy getting to know you, and I'm so excited. And again, you know, for a lot of people that don't know, Ben and I would geek out about monsters all of the time. All of the time. It was always, and I'm so, like, we always had this envisioned to do like some sort of scary story or scary, like we always had that envisioned for a speech, always. And I think that's always going to be in our brain of like, ooh, let's make this as spooky and strange as possible.
Yes. I try to push that on some students still, some takers at times, but most of the time they're like, I don't want to do anything like that. Like, okay,
yeah, they're like, what? Why? Why is that so dark? And it's like, okay,
right.
never mind. Next person.
Well, and that's why I love all the work that you've done with La Llorona and everything that way through. Because I remember you mentioning that whenever back in undergrad, even.
Yeah.
And to see everything that you've done exploring that, it's been really cool.
I'm so excited. I'm so thrilled. And I'm like, I'm just happy that you're here. Like I'm doing this and we're talking about these things years later. So,
yeah.
Well, I've been babbling. For people that also may not know who you really are, Ben, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah. So I am Ben Pyle. I am the director of the Alabama Forensic Council and an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at the University of Alabama. And so this is my 5th year here at the University of Alabama, which seems impossible, but
I know
they haven't gotten rid of me yet.
Oh my gosh, they could never. Oh man, that's crazy. I can't believe it's been 5 years.
Yeah. So I thought that I was done with speech whenever I left Western Kentucky University to follow my wife.
Yeah.
But, forensics has a way of roping you back in, and so it's been wonderful to return to the activity. And
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of brought you to the world of forensics, Ben? How did you find it? How did it find you?
So I had a middle school teacher that told me I was going to be on the forensics team whenever I got to high school. And so whenever I went to high school, I auditioned for it. I got on, and I was terrible. I was so bad that my coach tried to kick me off the team.
Oh my God.
I just don't think this activity is for you, Ben. And I begged and pleaded. I was like, please, what about those events with the black books or any of those things? And so it was through playing pretend and being embodied with characters that I was able to really kind of find myself. And then, 20 something years later, I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
And so, and I think for me, the big thing of forensics, whether it is if you're engaged in advocacy or you're engaged in interpretation, it's all storytelling. It's all how do we connect with people and allow them to empathize with people that way.
It's wild. I think a lot of people don't realize like that is such like one of the best parts of forensics. Like I think I mean, to be fair, on an outsider's perspective, they're like, I don't even know what that is. I have no clue what you all do. And that's fair. But you're right. I think there is that sense of empathy and walking in other people's shoes that keeps you coming back. Like, oh my gosh, like I love exploring these different worlds, you know?
In collaborating with students, because,
Yeah.
and that's the one thing that even though my gray hair is giving me away here,
Ben.
I think it keeps me young in a lot of ways because, I hear a lot of colleagues that will kind of bemoan, oh, this generation. But I get to listen to them every day and say, okay, I can understand them a lot more, and understand their concerns that they have for the world. And again, whenever we approach each other with empathy that way, it becomes less of, well, back in my day or this generation, they just don't want to work. It's that, maybe the values do look a little different.
Yeah.
But at their core, I think everyone just wants to be happy and to do their best. And I think whenever we meet each other there, like, okay, great. Now what can we build together and make better for everybody?
I think that's beautiful. I mean, and that's what makes a great teacher, because I mean, teaching, it's so hard. It is one of the hardest things. I argue one of the hardest occupations because of reasons like that. There's just that innate frustration of wanting so badly for your students to just go above and beyond and be well. And it's hard. Life is hard. Little brains and little bodies, they're going through so much at any given moment. And it's just like, oh man. And like, I know you've gone above and beyond, given all your spoons to anybody who's ever needed them before. What was it a big jump for you, Ben, when like you decided, I know you were a competitor for a long time, but then like transitioning into that like teaching role, was it jarring at first or did it kind of come natural?
So it was pretty natural for me. And I quickly learned to prefer it much more because my favorite part was always the construction of everything and like cracking an idea and being able to put everything together.
Yeah.
And then, whenever you got into the thick of performance and doing it over and over and over again, I mean, you make those discoveries, but it's always the initial part that's the most fun.
Oh,
like, how are we going to make this thing work? And I think for me, that's what has allowed me to kind of craft my philosophy toward both coaching and teaching. I had a lot of imposter syndrome whenever it came to standing in front of a classroom because I knew how to develop a relationship one-on-one with a student. But I didn't know necessarily how to manage a classroom or to make sure that I could still connect in those ways. But then I found out, oh gosh, if I'm just doing the same thing in terms of actually connecting with them, okay, cool. Then it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's real easy to build something up to be bigger than it is. And I think so much of what I do is still playing pretend. Even whenever I'm standing in front of a classroom, hey, we're talking about these abstract ideas.
Yes.
It is important, but at the end of the day, particularly the stuff I teach is not life and death. And so, if as long as I'm chill, I think everyone else can be okay too.
Yeah. And creating that safe space just goes such a long way. Like you mentioned, like for kids that maybe don't want to talk about life and death right now, they don't want to be in the real world right now. They kind of want to escape into a different land. And I think teachers have that magic quality to do that for kids, to make believe and play pretend. Like it goes a very long way. You know what I mean? That's so cool, Ben. So how did spookiness come to play?
So spookiness is, as I was reflecting on my kind of history with spookiness, it is completely intertwined with comic books and superheroes and everything. I loved Halloween is still my favorite holiday.
Yeah.
I remember there's like a picture of me at 3 or 4 years old dressed up as Batman.
Goodness.
And just the idea of being able to put on a mask and to be safely frightened was always something really neat. And I think so. I'm a person that has had anxiety my whole life,
Yeah.
and that's been something that I've only, as an adult, been able to actually lean into and say, like, okay, cool, let's actually unpack that and work with that in a lot of ways. And I think as a kid, I sought out the safety of spookiness to be like, cool, I'm having the same feeling, but it feels safe. Like, cool, like I know that this ridiculous monster isn't going to do anything to me, even though it might make me jump or anything that way too. And so,
Yeah.
spookiness, it was one of those things where whenever I'd be in a movie theater, I would I would laugh at the screen whenever the scares would happen, and some people might interpret that as, "Oh, you're just a sick weirdo." Um, but for me, it was more of a cathartic release. Like, oh gosh, oh thank goodness, what a ridiculous thing! It can't hurt me.
No.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so I think in a weird way, uh, and my wife doesn't like this as much, but sometimes I'll put on scary movies to go to sleep.
Oh, Jenny, poor Jenny.
And so at one point she had to tell me, you can't put on Alien tonight. I can't wake up to chest bursting aliens popping out of people tonight. And I'm like, okay, well, it's just so
Fine.
soothing to me, though.
Yeah. That is so fascinating how you said, like, because I totally understand what you mean. Like, I mean, growing up and, you said you had anxiety, and I don't want to, like, speak for you, but I imagine mental health wasn't easy to talk about or easy, to even understand the language of what you're feeling.
Right.
And with anxiety, and everybody's anxiety is very different, and mental health affects people in different ways, but like you're on constant like fight or flight, and you don't know why. Like your body's like, what am I feeling? Why am I scared? Something's going to happen. I'm going to die, blah, blah, blah. And ironically enough, seeing that fear and feeling a real visceral response to something that is scary, like you can feel it, feels so much better, because you're like,
Yes.
oh great, that's a real emotion, that's a real fear, a real feeling, and I feel calm because I feel like a human being again.
And it gives you a sense of control. Like, okay, cool. I know why I'm scared because that thing popped out at me. Great. Like, I can
Yes.
now identify this emotion. And so, yeah, in a weird way, scary stories, good for your mental health.
Make you feel real alive.
That's right.
That's so fascinating. Did you have, I mean, I know, and I really do want to go into the comic book
Oh,
areas,
sure.
of course, but I'm curious. I know you mentioned Alien. Were there scary movies that you always returned to growing
Yes.
up?
Oh, so again, I think so much of our, or at least for me personally, my interests are ingrained in childhood.
Yeah.
And it kind of sets the foundation for what are you going to seek out in the future.
Yeah.
And I remember there was this really goofy movie called The Monster Squad, and it had all of the old Universal monsters like Dracula and
Yes.
Monster and all that. And I don't want to bash the movie for people that are like, that's my favorite movie, but it's fine. It's a
That's
good
okay.
movie. But as a kid, I was like, holy cow, what is this? This is amazing. It was practically like the Avengers now, but of all the monsters,
Yeah. Yeah.
with some kind of 80s effects.
Twists. Yeah.
But that was one that made me seek out the original Universal Monster films, and they had those on, like AMC would
Oh,
have those
gosh.
Monster Fest marathons. And I loved the old Dracula and
Yeah.
Frankenstein and Mummy and Wolfman. And I also love my parents owned a video rental store whenever I was growing up.
What?
And yes, they ended up then going bankrupt and they lost the business. But
Sure.
for a while there in the 80s, whenever I was a wee little one, I got a chance to see all the like Freddy Kruegers and the Jason Voorhees and all that too. And that was all nice and baked into why I'm so weird.
Yeah, but that makes sense as to why it is such a comfortable place for you. I mean, having your parents run something like that sounds like a dream.
Yeah, it was neat. And yeah, got to bring the rentals home and no late fees taking them back.
Not
So.
at all. And you get to enjoy them as much as you want.
That's right.
Wow. So it really was those iconic, like, if people think of Monster, they might be like
Yeah.
those iconic individuals. That's
Right.
that's where you started.
Hmm.
Well, what do you think is a monster, Ben?
For me, I think monster is a behavior.
Mm.
And so, because that's what I like to think of whenever we're talking about superheroes and comic books and things that way. We can think of, well, that character, they look like a monster, but are they really? And that's what I kind of base it off of whenever we're looking at, like, say, Frankenstein's monster,
Yeah.
for example. In the film version, we see this creature that is come to life, of
Mm-hmm.
it's basically birthed and is figuring out the world. And so, do accidents happen? Accidentally, throw a girl in the lake,
Yeah. Yeah.
things of that nature. But we can call that behavior monstrous because it is outside of the scope of what we want to happen as a society and in the world.
Mm.
But then, whenever in the novel, then Frankenstein, the character starts to become more eloquent and be able to learn. But then his behavior becomes really monstrous because he seeks revenge on
Mm.
Victor Frankenstein. And so for me, that's how I've always kind of interpreted monstrosity.
Yeah.
Is what is the behavior you're engaged in?
Mm.
Is it that you might look a certain way, but you can act justly, right? Like, so, like the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
I don't think that typically doesn't pop up as a monster, because we empathize with the Hunchback.
Yeah.
This is a person who is doing their best despite how they look that
Yeah.
way. And so it's, for me, that's my long version of, I think the behavior of being a monster makes more of a difference than what they look like that way.
Which makes it a little bit more frightening, I think, because you can't necessarily tell visually how a being is going to act. And that's frightening in and of itself, And I think it's interesting, Ben, how you mentioned, like, when talking about like Frankenstein, for example, and then when they turn monstrous when they start seeking revenge, and revenge can be also seen as a very human thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like these human emotions of revenge, jealousy, anger, all these things.
Right.
And in your definition, I guess, do you think human beings can display monstrous behavior as well?
Exactly. And I think that's what the purpose of, or I think that's what monsters serve as a purpose for, is to show us how we are monstrous. So that, again, like you brought up the revenge quality there,
Yeah.
that is monstrous behavior. And I think that's the point of all storytelling. That's the point of having these creatures and these ideas, is to be able to have a shortcut for, what does that mean? What does a vampire mean? So it's, okay, great. If it's our traditional Dracula story, if we were to look at that through a modern lens, here's a person who is manipulating and gaslighting people into their own ends so that they can feed off of them. Great. There are plenty of people in the world that we can look at. They're saying that, okay, you are a type of vampire, or a person that unleashes their rage and is destructive that way. Now, each of those quote unquote monsters, I mean, for kids, it's, oh my gosh, is that real or not?
Yeah.
I think that's why I keep on returning back to them, is because I think I learn something more about myself every time that I look at one of these creatures that way too.
Oh, 100%. It's always very, I mean, it can be frightening in a sense, but when you're watching a scary movie or reading a scary novel or a comic book and you read about a monster and you think, I feel so much like that character. It can feel very jarring, especially if like you go to the end, it's like, oh great, the monster dies, the monster is killed by the village or whatever, right? Like it can feel very isolating, but also in a weird, maybe twisted kind of way, it's validating, like, oh, somebody out there exists that's like me.
Yes.
And I don't know, it's a weird dichotomy that I think monsters create for people.
Yeah, and the overcoming of the monster, I think, points to the hope for humanity that way too.
Mm-hmm.
Say, great, yeah, here is this person, and yet if we choose to, we can overcome it.
Yeah.
If it is the village coming together, I mean, mostly that one's all ignorance because they don't understand the creature.
Yeah.
But it is, Van Helsing putting the stake through a Dracula. Great, we're putting an end to this idea.
Yeah.
But we also know it's going to return. But how we respond to them when they return.
Right. There's going to be a part 2, part 3, part 4, probably somehow. But like, still, I mean, it's interesting. It's, oh man, I love scary stories so much.
Yes.
So much. And speaking of storytelling, Ben, what the heck is a comic book?
So comic books are sequential images.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sequential image storytelling. That actually, this goes back even to the Egyptians. Their hieroglyphs, you can't really carry those around or fold them up or anything. They use sequential images to be able to tell a narrative or a story that way. And so comic books do the same thing. They'll take these snapshot panels and they will tell a story, and your mind fills in the blanks or the gaps between how the story moves from one section to the other that way.
Yeah.
And just like with film or with video games, where if you look at the very early versions of those,
Yeah.
great, they can look very basic and straightforward, but then people get more creative in terms of its development and its evolution, and then it can start to look really, really unique as a medium that way too.
Fascinating. I never thought about that idea though, of like, how you said the panels are placed in a certain way, your mind filling in the blanks in between those panels. You know what I mean? Your imagination just kind of going wild. That's so cool. When were you first introduced to comic books, Ben, or how?
So I have a brother who's 14 years older than me.
Yeah.
And so right as I was turning 3 or 4, he went into the military. Mm-hmm. And so he couldn't take everything with him. So he left his comic books.
Yeah.
And so I remember going through all of his different comics and just being, whoa, my gosh, this is amazing. And particularly because at that time, they would have the old Adam West Batman followed by the Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk would always come on at the same time every day. And so I'd be able to sit there with my comic books and then look up and be like, oh, it's Batman time, or oh, it's Hulk time.
Yeah.
And be able to kind of point to like, oh my gosh, look, it's coming alive right there on the screen.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, I learned reading through comics. And it helped me a lot as a kid to be able to say, here's what's happening in the image. Oh, great. I know what they're saying. Or sometimes they would describe what's happening in the story.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was much easier for me to kind of pick up. And that's not to belittle comic books as childish literature. Some are. But just like with any medium, you can tailor it for youngsters all the way through however old you want to be.
100%. And I think you make a brilliant point that like people so often, when something is described as childish, people so often think it's less than, or, not as mature, not whatever. But I think some of the greatest lessons we ever learn are from children. And yes. I also feel like, the way you love comic books is the way I love cartoons. Right. And I think they kind of give you this nurturing way of learning and a safe way of learning, a visual way of learning. That is so brilliant. And not only does it nurture you at that age, but it nurtures your inner child, I think, continuously as you grow older. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's more people should, read comic books or watch cartoons or what have you, because you learn some amazing lessons, and there's nothing wrong with that. So what that there's mostly pictures? Who cares?
Yeah, it's brilliant imagery.
It's so good.
Yeah, and the same thing with animation. There's very mature storytelling, and there's mature storytelling in children's cartoons too. Like I know you're a big fan of Adventure Time.
Oh yeah.
like, yes, it's accessible to kids, and yet adults can love it too. I think that's the best type of storytelling, because then you can talk with kids and you can build a relationship with them and help to have a shared language for tough things that come up that way too.
For tough things, that shared language, you're absolutely right. It's just easier to digest difficult things when it's cute to look at, like a cute color or a cool page on a comic book. Like it's just easier.
Right.
And you need to talk about tough things. And I think, why not do it in that version, you
Right.
know? So, okay, so I know there are a million different types of versions of comic books, but I think at least for this specific episode, and I know I'm sure you could talk about hours, like about this topic, but can you break down what Marvel and DC are in the comic book world?
So, so in the comic book world, they're what we would call the big two.
Okay.
So there are multiple comic book publishers. There's Marvel and DC, which stands for Detective Comics. So in a weird way, it's Detective Comics Comics, but it's DC. But those two universes have their own kind of mythologies and characters that comprise them. And so, although traditionally, right now in media, it's primarily superheroes that we're familiar with each of those, both companies have also produced horror stories, romance stories, sports stories at times.
Yeah.
And so those two companies are owned. So Marvel is owned by Walt Disney, and then DC is owned by Warner Brothers currently.
Right.
And each of them have kind of subsumed some other companies in the past too. So DC, there was a imprint called Wildstorm that got kind of sucked into them. There was Charlton Comics. But in addition to them, there's also Image Comics, Dark Horse Comics, things of that nature.
Yeah.
But if you're watching a movie, I'd say probably 75 to 80% of the time is coming from either Marvel or DC characters. That way, they're instantly recognizable. We've probably grown up with them, or they, like my sweater that I have a whole bunch of merchandise that is being sold to you in one way or the other.
Yeah. What, did you bounce back and forth between both Marvel and DC growing up, or did you gravitate towards one?
I've always loved both.
Yeah.
And for me, the definition, or what drew me to both of them, so I think DC, particularly whenever I was reading as a kid, did a really great job of telling big scale, kind of mythological stories.
Yeah.
That whenever we're talking about Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman, they're bigger than us. They're godlike in a lot of ways. And so I know a lot of people say, well, Superman's boring. Well, if you approach him that way, but you're like, well, how do you beat him? Well, you beat him by getting to his heart. All I have to do is have kryptonite. Regardless, these are people writing these stories, and they're going to get out of it one way or the other.
Sure.
But the reason it resonates with us is because you don't want anything bad to happen to Superman.
Never.
Because he's good. Same thing with Batman. You want him to win because he's got everything stacked against him, even though he's going to have the perfect bat gadget.
Sure.
Get out of it that way. And then on the flip side with Marvel, they looked at really flawed people first. And how do those flawed people become heroes? And that was neat. So I think DC kind of worked backwards into the complexity of and the depth of character, whereas Marvel kind of started with, let's take this angsty teenager and turn him into a superhero. Okay, cool. How would a person like that engage as a superhero? Yeah. And so I think both directions really work. And that's why I sought both out that way too.
Yeah. I never thought about that way. That is so true. Because I think the first DC comic I was introduced to was Batman, of course. So I just always remember it being so dark. Like, obviously, yes, the visuals are so beautifully dark and cryptic. But I mean, the bad guys, I've always been so enamored with the bad guys in the Batman universe because those monsters are wild.
Yes.
And like, I've always been like, I have a huge fear of clowns. I hate clowns. Clowns are terrifying. They suck. I don't like them. And on par with that is the Joker a little bit. Even though he doesn't have traditional, I mean, he's a Joker, he's not necessarily a clown.
Right.
But his storylines, the way that like he pretty much just lives to see Batman kill him. Because Batman will never kill anybody, he vows not to, is wild to me. Like it's so it's so beautifully written. And it keeps you guessing, and it's so fascinating, and they're twisted. Those characters are twisted. But at the same token, right, like Marvel, you see yourself in that superhero role. I've always wanted to be Squirrel Girl.
Yes.
I'm always going to shoot for that one day, is to always be Squirrel Girl, right? Like you see so much fun in being that powerful, that anybody can be powerful and anybody can beat the bad guy, I think is. But I before we go into that too, Ben, and this might also be just as hard of a question as what a monster is, but what is a superhero?
So for me, I think a superhero is someone that is aspirational and embodies the qualities we want to have. And so I think that's a good distinction between characters like the Punisher, for example, who is an anti-hero. And the Punisher is a person who's very revenge driven.
Yeah.
His family was murdered. And so now he is extra violent on all of the bad guys. And so, and that's fun. That's a fun power fantasy to say, oh yeah, I can get my revenge on people too. But I don't think it's healthy for anyone to say, I want to grow up and be the Punisher. Right? Like, okay, great. Guns are baked into the concept of the Punisher. To be the Punisher, you have to use guns.
Yeah.
And so for me, and that's not disrespect on the character.
No.
That's the role that it serves.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think the superhero then is someone that does embody, like that shows us how to be strong in impossible scenarios. That whenever everything is stacked against you, how do you continue? And it's easy for the superheroes. When you have superpowers, you can overcome all these things.
Yeah.
But if we look at it all metaphorically, then it is, all these odds are stacked against me, and yet I have to keep going. And for me, that's always been my kind of safe harbor whenever life events happen, to be able to say, well, and particularly as a kid, whenever, oh gosh, you're facing failures, you're doing this. Well, but also remember that time whenever Spider-Man was trapped under everything and he said, I'm going to lift this for Aunt May antidote. Right. And same thing with, Superman and Kryptonite or Batman, whatever it is. It's about persevering and showing us how to be better.
Well said. Absolutely. It's not necessarily being unafraid. It's being afraid, but doing it anyway.
Right.
And I think that is the epitome of what brave should be, because they do get scared. And it's it's very validating when you see them get scared and worried and have emotions and have and I think, as you mentioned, like, do this for Aunt May.
Right.
Right. I think every single superhero has that one thing, one human connection. That people are like, the bad guys are like, that's going to be your downfall because I know exactly how to get to you. But for us normal people, it makes us feel so much better because it's like, yeah, me too. Like, I have human connections and I can do things for people and I can persevere, but I think that's a wonderful definition. And how would you define anti-hero, Ben?
I think that is the one where they are, if we're looking at kind of the scales of like good and evil, they're tipped more good than evil. But we wouldn't necessarily call their behaviors just or what we would seek out in society that way. And so, again, I think those return to a lot of power fantasies of, oh, if only I could go into the workplace and tell off this one person or do whatever that way. Yeah, it's behavior that we wish we could do in our fantasies, but doesn't really serve the greater good.
Right.
Or is at least how I've conceptualized it that way. Like, I love those characters.
I know.
Kind of the smell test for me is always, would I feel comfortable passing this along to my nephew? If not, like, well, okay, probably more of an anti-hero.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily. Like, I feel like Deadpool kind of falls into that sort of, because it's not necessarily, oh, I would pass this down to my nephew. This is interesting.
Right. And I think Deadpool's a great definition for that too, because again, he's hilarious, fun to watch,
Totally.
and yes, slices people up, shoots people, and
Yeah,
does all that too, and also engages in very selfish behavior too. And I think maybe that's a part of the anti-hero equation, is that more often than not, they're serving their own ends too. So like Punisher, he's not necessarily doing it to get rid of crime. So if we're comparing Punisher and Batman,
Sure.
Batman suffers a similar loss of all of his family.
Yeah.
And then vows no one else is going to lose anybody whenever I'm around. Punisher says, I have to eradicate all crime because I have to punish them.
Yeah.
Right. So he gets validation from punishment rather than, again, he's not doing it for anyone else other than himself.
Yeah. That's interesting. I never thought about that kind of selfish attitude in that way. And it's interesting how they all end up, and maybe that wasn't their intention, but they end up saving the world or whatever the story is. And they're like, oh, well, okay. And that's kind of like the interesting part of those comics is like, all right, well, accidentally save the world. That's very anti-hero of you.
Yes.
Which is cool.
Right.
Okay. So who is the Incredible Hulk, Ben?
Oh, my goodness. So the Incredible Hulk, Dr. Robert Bruce Banner.
Yes.
Was, so Dr. Bruce Banner is a physicist who was working to develop a gamma bomb whenever he looks out into the desert, and on the test site, there's this teenager that is lounging in his Jeep and is unaware that this gamma bomb is about to go off.
Right.
So Bruce Banner runs out there, pushes the kid to safety. I don't know how that works. He's pushed into a ditch when this bomb goes off. So the kid's okay, even though this bomb goes off.
Sure.
And Bruce Banner is bombarded by gamma radiation. And so gamma radiation in comics works very different than gamma radiation in the real world.
Right.
But gamma radiation in comics ends up transforming and mutating Bruce Banner's cells so that he can transform into a gigantic, brutish, muscular creature we all love as the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
And so Bruce Banner is approximately maybe like 5'9". The Hulk, depending on who's drawing him or animating him, can be anywhere from like 7 to 9 feet tall. And so he's always telling everyone he's the strongest one there is, and just wants to be left alone.
That is wild. So Dr. Bruce Banner had that, I guess, selflessness already in him. And that's kind of what turned him into this character, this superhero.
Right. In his origin, he makes this selfless act to be able to save a teenager and then becomes cursed with unleashing the Hulk that way. And so Rick Jones, the teenager, ends up becoming kind of his Robin or Bucky throughout all the stories because he feels guilty. Like, oh my gosh, you got turned into this. I got to help you out. But yeah, so again, and I think that's smart in terms of building up. The first thing is we do see that selfless act with Bruce
immediately.
Banner. Yeah. So that it wasn't because he's the Hulk that he was heroic. He was heroic as Bruce Banner.
And that just multiplies it and also challenges it now because, if people looked at the Hulk and didn't know anything about comics or anything, you would think they were the bad guy probably because big green guy, big, scary, muscular, ripped like clothes. Like he just looks monster-esque, I guess. When were you first introduced to the Incredible Hulk?
So it was in that pile of comics that I got from my brother. There was one with the Hulk, and he was being attacked by Wolverine and the Thing from the Fantastic Four and the Abomination on the cover. And I was just, whoa, this is amazing. Look at this. And also, at that time, the Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby Incredible Hulk series was on rotation regularly, too. And so I would always look forward to, and they would always play it after the Adam West Batman. I would watch the Adam West Batman, and then I get my Incredible Hulk after that.
Yeah.
But it was really that one comic too, where I looked through it and I had so many questions, because in that comic, which was mid '80s when it was printed, he was gray, and he was working as a Las Vegas bouncer. And he was wearing a pinstripe pants, and he wore white gloves.
Incredible.
He was talking, and was talking like a gangster. Like, and I was trying to square, but on TV he's green, but here he's gray.
Yeah.
And so whenever he's green on TV, he can't talk, and he just grunts and everything. But here he does this, and so I ended up always seeking out more issues to be like, what's going on, and trying to figure out the story with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's always been a really cool thing with the Hulk, is every time the story changes. And I mean, that should be the case with all stories.
Sure.
But every time the Hulk, we think we figured out the Hulk, he changes in a different way. It is what keeps me kind of coming back, even as a fan today.
Yeah, he is very interesting. And like, you're right. You think you've seen all of there is to the Hulk, but you haven't. Just watch a different movie, pick up a different comic, and he is completely different. Right. I never thought about that. That is so true. So, okay, so you mentioned he does, like, when he's in his green matter, I guess, he grunts. He doesn't really speak in a way like, I guess, English necessarily. But what are some other rules, like, to the Hulk? Like, when does he transform or does not transform or anything like that?
So when the Hulk was originally published in the 60s, on the very first issue, he's gray.
Right.
And so the intent behind that, so the co-creators, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, wanted him to not have any distinguished race, so that any kid could kind of imagine themselves being the Hulk that way. Problem was, the printing quality at that time, gray was really tough to be able to do. And so after the first issue, they're like, "Oh my gosh, this was a problem. Let's just change it to green." And they came up with a whole reason for why he changed green there.
Brilliant.
But in that first issue, he would change into the Hulk at night. So it wasn't due to anger or anything. It was just whenever the sun sets, out comes the Hulk.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until later on, a few issues, that they discovered, well, actually, it's when he's angry that he transforms. And so that's been something that they've continuously returned to, is why does Bruce Banner transform into the Hulk?
Yeah.
And colloquially, everyone kind of, they're quote the Bill Bixby line in the old 70s show, "You won't like me when I'm angry," or "You wouldn't like me when I'm angry." And so we've all assumed, well, it's just anger. It's whenever he gets angry or whenever his anxiety hits, he turns into the Hulk.
Yeah.
They've actually come up with multiple reasons for why the Hulk exists. And it wasn't until, about the 80s, or 70s and 80s, that they started exploring the psychology of Bruce Banner a little bit more. And so they added more complexity to his backstory, and that it wasn't the gamma bomb that turned him into the Hulk. It was his childhood, that he grew up in an abusive home with an abusive alcoholic father who killed his mother. And so whenever he was a kid, he learned to fear anger and fear and any type of emotion. So he became very repressed emotionally that way. And the lesson he took from that was extreme emotion is to be avoided and is terrifying, because he saw that in his father, and he worried what he might become if he were to ever let that loose that way. And into the teenage years then, he doesn't really date. He doesn't really explore anything that engages too emotionally. Yeah. He becomes a very good scientist because he's
to himself and facts and
but that then is the kind of the lineage for where the Hulk is born. So the Hulk was actually born as a kid, And there are multiple personalities that Bruce Banner has inside of himself.
Yeah.
And so I think the disorder is called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. And there's a lot of debate on the validity of those things and,
Sure.
and how to explore that. But the concept is that whenever traumatic events happen, a person can dissociate and create some distance from themselves in that event.
Mhm.
And then in some cases, a persona will then subsume those memories or cope with that. And so the Savage Hulk, the one that we are probably the most familiar with in multimedia,
Yeah.
represents Bruce's childhood anger. That childish brute that lashes out, that says, I'm going to stomp, I'm going to, have a temper tantrum. I want all of this to end, and I'm just going to smash everything. And he continuously shouts, Hulk smash,
Yeah.
or leave me alone, which is typically it. Like, that Savage Hulk just wants to be left alone, for people not to cause these extreme emotions in him, and for him to live in peace. And so that childish reaction is something that we can each kind of relate to that way too. And it's a unique kind of power fantasy also for uh, if only I could just let all of this out, and just everyone would have to listen to me at that point. So there's that Savage Hulk.
Yep. Okay.
There's also the Gray Hulk, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
They later came up with this idea that, all right, well, who was the Gray Hulk? We had it for that.
You have to figure that out. Yeah.
There's few issues. Why was he green? Why was he gray? Why was he green? And so the Gray Hulk embodies that repressed teenager that never got a chance to be rebellious or to date or to do those things.
Yeah.
And so the Gray Hulk becomes this very self-centered, absorbed, mean-talking, but also kind of charming, self-confident guy that Bruce Banner wishes he could have been as a teenager. He's the one that is able to talk anybody out of anything or hustle people, whatever it is. And so later on, Bruce Banner decides to get therapy, which is probably healthy for him.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know that.
So, but of course, you can't just have a normal therapist. His therapist is Dr. Leonard Sampson, or Doc Sampson, who has also been gamma irradiated.
Of course.
And he, 7 foot tall, muscular, he's got green hair that looks like Fabio. And he decides to help Bruce Banner merge these disparate personalities. And so the Green Hulk and the Gray Hulk and Bruce Banner merge together into the Professor Hulk. And so it is, he is just as smart as Bruce Banner, as self-confident as the Gray Hulk, and as powerful as the Green Hulk. And so he would wear clothes too, like huge, gigantic clothes. But he'd be seen in like a black tank top and pants, and then be seen, lounging back and sipping wine or whatever it might be. And so for a while, he thought of himself as kind of the ideal version. And in a weird way, he would transform back to the Bruce Banner form if he got angry. So the savage mentality would come out if the Professor Hulk were pushed to extreme anger. He'd turn into scrawny Bruce Banner, still raging and trying to punch things and being ineffectual that way. And so kind of comedic. But in a weird way, that's also kind of neat in terms of, look how small our anger makes us that way too.
Yeah.
So one of the problems with that personality, though, too, is, again, he's so arrogant and so self-assured that he looks over his flaws that way too. The fourth kind of main one.
Okay.
So he also has a gladiator persona. He's got all kinds of different Hulks in him.
Yeah.
But those three that we just talked about are kind of the main ones, and then there's a fourth one called the Devil Hulk.
Oh.
And so he represents the father figure that Bruce never had. So the father in his life was incredibly destructive and awful. And that's still baked into the concept of what father is for him. So even though he doesn't have the father that he wants, his mind has built up a version of the father that would protect him. And so the Devil Hulk is vindictive and mean, and ultimately wants to protect Bruce at all costs. And so it's a really nice relationship there in terms of he comes out to protect Bruce, but he wants to destroy the whole world because that's the only way for Bruce to be safe. Is we got to set everything back to square one. And so, climate change, all of these things are happening because of humanity.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of humanity, and then Bruce can be happy that way.
Oh my gosh.
And so, internally, Bruce has conversations with each of the different Hulks
Yeah.
at times. And that's why and in that version too, the Hulk transforms when he dies. So whenever there was this series called the Immortal Hulk,
Okay.
and Bruce Banner during the day, if he were to get injured and die, by night, he would return as the Immortal Hulk. So again, the rules for him transforming into the Hulk will always shift and always change.
Okay.
And in a way, I kind of like that because if we look at the Hulk as a metaphor for mental health, for example, it's real tempting to be able to say, I've done some self-work on myself and I've figured it out. I've achieved mental health. I get the gold star, A+, I figured out mental health.
Yeah.
And I think whenever you reach that status, all of a sudden, whoop, it changes. Or life happens.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you have to reconceptualize yourself again.
Yeah.
And say, oh no, I thought I had it figured out, but now I don't again. And I don't know if that's necessarily intentional all the time whenever people are approaching the Hulk. But that's what's been bringing me back to the character.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I had no idea, number one, that there were all these different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
But how, oh my God, just how emotional his entire storyline is to be able to craft those different personas. Oh my goodness. I had no idea. And I mean, it's so heartbreaking at the same time to see a person that is trying to figure themselves out, because we all are, and thinks that, trying to make the person that other people will find desirable or that other people will like better than you. You see them as stronger, just better all around. And I feel like that's what Bruce was kind of juggling with, is like, I am not perfect. I am not superhero enough in my own skin. And so here are all these different ways that I can process this. And also, as you mentioned, DID, which is so complex.
Right.
That dissociative quality also brings you back to, like, as a child, feeling safer
Right.
in that way of, like, let me be angry, let me give an extreme emotion, let me put on a mask, let me do something completely I would never do, because that makes me stronger and I can fight this. And I mean, oh my gosh. And it's just wild to me, like, that he has so many different layers. That is crazy.
And I think one of the core qualities is his self-hatred.
Yeah.
That's baked into it also, because so many of the stories resolve around him trying to get rid of the Hulk. My life would be okay if I could just get rid of the Hulk.
Yeah.
I wouldn't cause this destruction. I wouldn't do any of these bad things if only I could get rid of the Hulk. But in that, he overlooks the good qualities of the Hulk. Whenever he is a part of the Avengers, saving the day, being a hero, he only sees the negatives. He only sees the times whenever he gets out of control and causes destruction, which again, bad.
Sure.
But that is, I think, the core of, and why that narrative continues, is because he's at odds with himself. And eventually that's, if they're ever going to end the story, it is, okay, Bruce can finally accept himself and fully bring all of himself together that way. Yeah. But there are times whenever he'll kind of make up with the Hulk and say like, hey, look, we're friends after all. But then the Hulk, as a childish persona, can feel abandoned and betrayed, saying, I'm part of you. Why are you trying to get rid of me?
Yeah.
And I liken that to each of our relationships with our own inner children, too, that way. That it can be real easy to look at ourselves and blame our past selves for where we are now, or to look back at our childhoods and to, again, really kind of destroy this image of yourself that way. And I think whenever, counseling or in therapy, they say we need to do some inner child work. I think the Hulk is a really nice metaphor for that.
Him constantly doing that inner child work with those different personas. And that is, inner child work is unbelievably vulnerable and terrifying. You kind of feel like you're in the dark when you're doing that kind of work with a therapist, because you also didn't know that your inner child was going through anything, or that you were missing out on something, or being dissociative in some cases. It's a very terrifying thing. So for Bruce to be doing that constantly with these different personas, I mean, can you imagine, Ben, like dealing with your middle school self, or like dealing with, I mean, like it was hard enough then, like that was way hard. And like now it's like coming to terms with it and accepting that.
Right.
Which is a beautiful thing for him to say that he can do.
Right.
But then you get to write like the devil Hulk. And that's like fighting a battle that no one can really win, because that was with your father who's no longer here, doing things that you weren't even old enough to understand and old enough to defend yourself.
Right.
Again, to have the language for what your father did. And it's interesting because I think that's how a lot of us are. You don't really see your parents as human beings until you become an adult.
Right.
Because to you, they're just parents. You don't know any different. You think that you are their entire world, which you may be, but there was 30, 40 years before you came into the world. And you don't realize that. You don't realize, those things until you make mistakes or you have a life of your own. And it's so heartbreaking for children having to go through that type of abuse and that type of maltreatment and not have any answers, especially if the parent doesn't care and, they don't make amends or they die or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And him constantly searching. Do you know, Ben, if he ever made amends with the Devil Hulk, or ever, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So again, like comic books do, it's all on a grand scale. And so his dad returns from hell.
Of course.
And starts causing all kinds of problems. And the Devil Hulk ends up kind of reconciling with the other personalities of Bruce, to be able to help him overcome and beat his father, who's returned. And so, and again, stories like that, they're on this grand scale.
Yeah.
They do serve as those metaphors too, in terms of Bruce went on this great arc in which he had to reconcile his relationship with his father in the past. And then after that creative run, Hulk changes again. And so in the run directly after that one, Hulk turned into a spaceship. And Bruce Banner is piloting him through space as a spaceship. It's like, okay, how weird can we make it?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, and that's what I love too, is I love that I think superhero storytelling is the best when it doesn't take itself too seriously. That it has to be able to be goofy as a concept for you to be able to feel safe with it that way too. Because otherwise then we do get people that are inspired to embody those things. And I keep returning back to the Punisher there.
Yeah.
That if I'm inspired by the Punisher, great. Now I am picking up a gun and taking law into my own hands.
Right.
Or if I'm inspired by the Hulk, okay, it's okay for me to smash things whenever I'm angry. Not necessarily.
Right.
Like I can't turn big and green and do that.
No.
These larger than life qualities help to make us laugh at some of those qualities too.
Because sometimes you do feel goofy in piloting, literally spaceshipping your own emotions. Like that's kind of how you feel sometimes. And as you mentioned, like at the very beginning when we began talking, right, when you would watch scary movies and sometimes your first reaction was to laugh.
Right.
Because it's just silly. Like sometimes that's just the easiest way to cope with these complicated situations is to laugh through them and find out what makes them so goofy and silly. And it's easier to gain control and have autonomy when you see those human things, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because so my wife loves true crime podcasts. And so whenever we're getting ready in the morning, she'll have those on and I'll be like, oh my gosh. And she's like, but you watch horror films all the time.
Yeah.
And those aren't real. Like those, blood and guts splattering, all that stuff.
Yeah.
I know is not real.
Right.
And the true crime stuff really disturbs me though.
Yeah.
And listening to, oh, this is a person who did this monstrous thing that you would never have suspected that person to do.
That is so true. It's weird. I totally agree with you on that front too. It's far more terrifying when that person has lived and walked the same streets as you have or whatever it may be. And again, it's that weird feeling of behavior, back to your monster definition. You don't realize that human beings can do stuff like that, or you don't like to think that human beings can do stuff like that.
Right.
But they do, and they have, and they will all the time. And so it's so much easier to be like, yep, pilot that spaceship, Hulk, do whatever you got to do. I like that better, way better. So, Ben, why is the Incredible Hulk so important to you? Or why do you think you've kept gravitating toward him or the story for so long?
For me, again, all this stuff is talking about mental health and your youth that way too. And for me, whenever I'm thinking of myself as a kid, those superheroes were baked into it and monsters and everything. And that is a way that, and I think that's the reason that I stay with comics and these stories is because it is a tie to my personal history in a way too, that whenever I return to an old issue, I can kind of remember where I was at the time. Like with that one issue that I brought up with Hulk fighting all the people on the cover.
Yeah.
When I think of that issue, I think of myself in my childhood home, and I'm tied to that space that way too. But I think the character of the Hulk, every time that I have returned to him throughout my life, I'm discovering a new version of myself too. And I'm learning about aspects of my own personal history that help me to explore difficult concepts in a safe way too. And for me to be able to explore those ideas safely. And again, thinking through a devil persona or some of these, what they represent in ways you can kind of think through what are versions of myself that have shown up throughout my life. And what are the versions of myself that I'm proud of? What are the versions of myself I'm not proud of? What are the versions of myself that I'm scared of? And how do I reconcile and incorporate all those and accept all of those without judging them moving forward? And I think that that's the neat conflict that's baked into the Hulk is he struggles so much to accept himself, and particularly because the rest of the world is telling him, you are a problem. And at one point they shoot him out into space on a different planet. He becomes a gladiator on that planet. You're causing too much destruction here on Earth. So adios. Get on the planet. And then he finds a way to come back and then takes out his wrath on all the superheroes that shot him into space. Right?
Yeah,
so
of course.
I think as long as they keep the conflict within himself, he's going to be a character that stays around for, however long. But it's whenever they resolve him, I always hope it's not for too long because it's interesting.
And seeing him have that conflict makes you feel validated.
Right.
and like, okay, I can have these multiple personas that I may not be proud of, and the
Right.
mistakes that I've made that I am not keen on or proud of, and that's a very difficult thing to admit, right? And at the same time, I think seeing that, like, yeah, I do take up space, and you may not like that, and you may not like how big I get, or how strong I get, or how angry I get, but that doesn't mean I'm any less valid, or that my feelings aren't valid. You know what I mean? Sometimes you do feel like running around and throwing a tantrum like a 4-year-old. Like, that's just the only way you can encapsulate that moment or that situation. And I think that's really amazing, Ben, that you've come to terms with those different parts of yourself, because that's hard.
Yes.
That's so hard to do, and I think we're all constantly learning how to do that, and I think it's beautiful that you can do that through the guise of not only a metaphor, but of a character such as the Incredible Hulk.
Well, and I think that's why superheroes are important, is because, again, the Hulk works for little kids.
Yeah.
You can put him in a preschool oriented story talking about big feelings. And oh gosh, the Hulk got mad and smashed this. And again, and the kids can laugh at the Hulk too.
Yeah.
He talks very simplistically, like, oh, he talks like a baby. Oh, again, the concept works for kids. And then that kid, if they stick with them and they're like, oh my gosh, I remember that Hulk. I wonder what's going on there. And they decide to check out maybe some more mature reading. Oh, wow. Oh, cool. I have a link back to that concept as a kid again. And I can return to that.
Yes.
And so, like we were talking about earlier, I think the stories work best whenever they can reach both audiences. And I think that's why a lot of people, particularly my age, and I think that's why a lot of movies right now, I know there's a lot of people bemoaning the dominance of superheroes on the big screen.
Whatever. Yeah.
But it does serve as a neat way to connect parents and kids, to be able to talk about it. In a lot of ways, people might not be recognizing what they stand for, things that way. But if they do, they can lean into, hey, you're having a big moment right now. Let's, bring in the anger or whatever it might be.
That's so true. And I wish I read a book with the Hulk as a kid, and I think you make a great point in that these books or movies or shows that people deem childish, what's so great about them is you don't necessarily have to figure anything out. Like, everything's kind of laid out for you, and emotions are laid out for you, and it's color coordinated, right? So it's like, okay, Hulk is green and angry and jealous or envious. And that's easy for me to understand. When he's green, he's angry. When he's not, he's calm, or, not having any conflict. And that goes such a long way, especially for individuals, I think, with anxiety, because you constantly think, I don't truly know what's going on. I have no control. How do people actually feel? How do I actually feel? How does the world work? Like, you're just constantly questioning everything. And when you have it laid out for you, like the Hulk and his personas, and you can easily identify what emotion they're feeling based on what they look like, it's a dream. It's a total dream. You don't have to beat yourself up or try to figure out anything. It's there.
And one of the things that I really appreciate that they've done with the Hulk, and so whenever comics were becoming more mature, then they start to look into some darker storylines that way too.
Yeah.
And one of the darker places they took the Hulk was whenever Bruce Banner was contemplating suicide, because this is the only way that I can't get rid of this any other way. And so they would explore it as, if you were to try to do that, the anxiety would still cause the Hulk to come out, and he wouldn't be able to die. And I always viewed that as dangerous for kids. That, if I am a teenager that is reading an issue of that, like, cool, if I do identify with a character that way, the only way out that with this depression or anxiety or whatever I'm facing here is that type of exit. I didn't like that. So I liked whenever they made the Hulk immortal and saying that if he does die, he's going to come back. And I liked that because it changed it from he's got to live with himself. That even if he were to die, you're going to come back. And I liked that, as not to get rid of the previous thoughts. Maybe he did have those depressive thoughts.
Yeah.
Now he has to move forward and to say, I got to live with myself. I have to be able to lean into how to make this work. And that's the thing that I know whenever people are looking at trying to make superheroes more mature or more adult, I do think that there is some care that needs to be thought through in terms of shepherding these heroes. Whenever Batman is shown using a gun, I cringe, because
Yeah.
what I grew up with is Batman doesn't kill.
Mm-mm.
And Batman is an easy concept for kids to understand, to want to dress up as. And the second you show him using a gun, that all of a sudden it transforms it in a really way too dark way.
Yeah.
And the point of Batman is he doesn't need guns. He's got the utility belt that has repellent or what it does, the tool to be able to solve the problem. And same thing, I think in Iron Man 3, they showed Robert Downey Jr. shooting a gun.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like he's got a $1 billion suit. He's a genius. Why are you showing him use a gun?
He doesn't need to.
Whenever he can think his way out of this in a different way. And again,
Yes.
whenever people are trying to make these stories more realistic or darker, that way they equate that with how it looks in the real world today. Well, I would do this. That's not what these stories are for.
No.
They're to show us how we can be better and how we, again, those worlds don't exist. They're fairy tales. They're fantasies for us to escape and to imagine what could we do if we had these powers, or what if we could do it differently that way.
That's a brilliant point. I mean, and you're absolutely right. Like, all stories are so impressionable. Whatever you watch as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, like, that will stay with you for the better or for the worse. And, I think having those strong feelings of the need or the want to take your own life is such a universal feeling for many young children. A lot of people don't think it starts very young, but it does start very young.
Right.
And, very much they might just be like, oh, I can 100%, if I try to do this, it's okay. Like, I will live on, or I'll come back.
Right.
And that's not always true. It's not true. And I think, like you said, the adverse of, like, but what if you tried living? Yes. Like, what if you kept going, despite all of the feelings that you feel? Like, that's a true superhero, to keep going. And not to say that, like, your dark thoughts make you any less of a human being or any less of a person, because they're very human and very natural to think those things.
Yeah.
But to keep going is so strong.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I mean, I cringe too whenever I see guns anyway, but guns, especially in a context of, like, comic book worlds.
Right.
Number one, you don't need them. You take me out of it. Just, like, on a story level, you take me out of it. I'm like, come on. Like, we're not doing that. Like, that makes no sense. But again, so impressionable. These things are so impressionable. And if you're showing a quote unquote good guy with a firearm or something like that, like, who knows what goes through a young mind?
Right.
That's not your only way to defeat a battle. It shouldn't be any way to defeat a battle, really.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that's a really good point, is sometimes the dark things also become impressionable. You have to be aware of that in storytelling, always.
Yeah.
Okay. So you did mention why are superheroes so important to you in general, but more specifically, Ben, why do you think the existence of the Incredible Hulk is so necessary? And that can be story-wise, like the actual character, or even the franchise, or even Marvel, comic books, however you want to identify it.
I think at a certain point, the character becomes bigger than movies, comics, toys, anything else. I think it's one of those characters that you can just tell anybody, like, oh, I'm about to Hulk out. Everyone understands colloquially what that means.
Yeah.
And he does represent power, anger, rage that's baked into the human condition, or like unleashing yourself. And I think it also speaks to that, as much as Bruce Banner views it as a problem, I think it also speaks, he doesn't see, look how powerful I am inside. Like, I have so much power in me that I can do this. And I think I don't think the concept is ever going to go away, because it's just too simple. It's a simple, and those are the best ideas.
Always.
It's so hard to create something like that, but then whenever you crack it, great, everyone understands it. I'm going to Hulk out. The same thing with, if you say Dracula, you say Frankenstein, they're baked into our core memories, and we have behaviors that are associated with them. And that human condition is going to keep those alive that way too. And I think in some ways, he might outlast other characters, just because that human condition that we can't control.
Yeah.
For a long time, Iron Man wasn't really that popular in the comics. And it wasn't until really the movie that all of a sudden everyone's like, well, let's revisit Iron Man. Yeah. I've always liked Iron Man. Yeah. But I think, prior to the movie, if someone were to say Iron Man, they might have to scratch their heads a little bit and to say, okay, who was that? But they might still have known the Hulk back then.
Oh, yeah.
And so I don't think he's going anywhere.
No, he's timeless. He's incredibly because feelings are big feelings are incredibly timeless. And I think, I don't know, it's such a joy when you see the Hulk. And if you think of some of these more recent Avengers movies or anything like that, he often is thrown in as comic relief. A lot of the time, like when things get really heavy, they're like, hey, but look at this guy. He's silly. And as beautiful as that is, though, I think it's also kind of heartwarming to see someone at those simple, like having that simple storyline or that simple arc of like, yes, good and bad. It's just so nice to see that. Yes. And you're right. It's timeless. I think he's always going to be a character. I think he's always going to have new storylines and new arcs and new discoveries and reach new audiences at any age. So, okay. So in your words, Ben, do you think, is he a man or a monster, or is he both?
Yes, I love that line.
That's a good line, Ben.
On the very first cover, that's the question that it asks. And it's in the shape of a question as well. So it's like the words are written in a question. Is he a man or monster, or is he both? And I was thinking about that before we talked. I was like, oh my gosh, what is it going to be? And I lean toward both.
Yeah.
But I also kind of think none of those is. I think that he is certainly a man. He certainly has been monstrous in his behavior. Yeah. That the Hulk has not always been virtuous. At times he has sought out revenge. At times he has been a villain in narratives.
Yeah.
And just as much as he's been a superhero that way, which I love also because it shows that we're not always the heroes in every narrative. That for some people, we are their villains.
100%.
Even though we think we're acting justly that way. And so I think the simple answer would be, well, he's both. He's both of those things. But I don't know what the word is to actually describe him that way. I think he's much more complex. I think whenever we start to look at things in dichotomies, man or monster.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm still stuck in that dichotomy, though.
Yeah.
Well, whenever he's a monster, he's this. When he's a man, he's this. I'd say he's complex. Just like all of
us. Yes. And I think that is a wonderful answer. You're speaking like a true folklorist right now, Ben. One of the most frustrating things for me when doing folklore work in the academic sphere is that like just the overall consensus is that there's not a definite definition for anything.
Right.
And because what's folklore? Well, it could be so many different things. Or when people are saying like, oh, those individuals way back in BC that believed in mythology and things, that's not real. And it's like, why? why is that not real? It's real to them. They felt real emotions to these occurrences and these stories. So why is it not real? Right. And so you're always battling with like, why can't everything be true? Because it just depends on you and your situation and your context. And so I think you saying he is all things
Yeah.
at any given moment gives you the space and gives you the freedom to be all things
Yep.
at any given moment, and to feel all things and to fear all things. And as scary as that is, it's very liberating.
And to not judge any of those things too.
Yeah.
Right. Because if it is, well, I'm a man, well, then the monster side then is bad. Or if I'm a monster, well, then
the man side is bad. Yeah.
I like being able to have paradoxes that way. Those contradictions, I think, are fascinating to me. To say, like, here's a person who we conceptualize as good and yet still does bad things. Is a much more nuanced and, I think, mature way to navigate the world. Because that's the case, is it is really easy for us to lump people into good or monstrous behavior.
Of course.
And then to define a person solely by that instance as well. And it is much harder to say, yes, all that stuff is monstrous, and yet they're still a person. And how do we reconcile that? Or that person is monstrous and they're still my family member, or things of that nature. And so that is one of the good things about a concept like the Hulk. But I think one of the potential pitfalls is it's housed in a universe in which good battles evil all the time.
Always, yeah.
So it's we do return back to the dichotomy all the time, and same thing in like horror films too.
Sure.
There is monster. So it's, I don't know. I like my ands rather than ors.
That is a lovely way to put it. I mean, it's easier that way. I don't know. It's complicated. I think we could just leave it at that. It's incredibly complicated, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It can be complicated. And I imagine your answer would be similar when I ask you, is he a scary being? Like, is the Hulk scary?
Yes. I think that's why he is so attractive also, is because he's scary.
Yep.
That anger is scary. Our emotions are scary. And that's why I love that's baked into that concept is, oh my gosh, if I were to get that angry, what would happen? Or what would happen if I fully feel my feelings?
Yeah.
But that's the work that we all have to do, is to lean into actually feeling our feelings. And that's what he represents that way, is fully leaning into that feeling. And what does it look like? And the world has to see it and engage with it. Yeah. And like you said earlier, make space for it that way too. And, but he's also cuddly and friendly to kids, if he be. And that's what I like about whenever he shows up in cartoons geared toward kids. He can be smiling and having fun, and we can laugh at him at times. But as a concept, I think fear is going to be dominant.
Yeah. It's just innate. It's just natural. And I think if we start humanizing fear a little more, it makes you stronger.
Right.
So what does incredible mean to you?
Beyond belief. So it's it shouldn't exist, and yet it does. And I think that is something that, particularly, I mean, throughout my whole life, I continually find things incredible. Like, I didn't think this was possible, and yet here I am. Whether that is, a good circumstance or a bad one. And I think baked into that word, in the concept of it, is that you have to believe it. It's there. It exists. You don't think it and you can't believe it, and yet there it is. Is he man or monster? Is he both? He is.
Yes.
Yeah, a frustrating answer. Is he man or monster? Is he both? Yes. Well, you didn't answer any part of that.
Exactly.
Yet that isn't the answer. It's incredible. You can't believe it, and yet it has to be true.
Well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. He is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So why should monsters and their narratives keep going? Why should people talk about monsters? Why should they watch monsters on TV? Why are monsters important?
They are emotional shorthand for us. That, just like with the Hulk, I can point to and explore concepts of rage, depression, sadness, whatever it is that way. Same thing with whatever horror monster might come up. They each, at least the concepts that stick, they're about so much more than killing people or the scares.
Yeah.
That the concept itself is about a larger human condition in some way, whether that is revenge or powerlessness or something of that nature. We're always going to have monsters because they reflect those behaviors that we find monstrous. So that's why, even if we were all collectively to be like, hey, you know what, monsters are boring, we're not going to do that anymore, we would find a new one.
Always.
And in some cases, and that's what I appreciate about our concept of monsters, they often reflect the times in a lot of ways, too.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Whenever the Marvel comics, for example, were being birthed, there was the nuclear scare. And so that's why Spider-Man is bitten by a radioactive bug, or radioactive spider. Why the Hulk is bombarded with gamma radiation.
Right.
Why the Fantastic Four is hit by cosmic rays.
Yeah.
It's this fear of, what does radiation do to us? How powerful is it? And so then that permeates our heroes and our creatures at the time. I loved whenever they did the remake of The Invisible Man.
Oh my gosh.
And I loved that they updated that for the times, that, okay, now this is reflective of Me Too and gaslighting and gender dynamics. Great. Yeah, it's a guy that turns invisible. It's about way more than that, though.
Always.
And I was like, that's how you keep a monster alive, is it reflects, what are we afraid of right now, or what are we uncomfortable with right now? And that then serves as an emotional shorthand to have those discussions with your partner or whoever. My wife and I just recently watched the Barbie movie. I loved it. It was amazing.
Yeah.
And I remember her saying, well, I was so happy that you enjoyed it, because apparently there were a lot of breakups around that film, because whether women were realizing the type of relationship they're in, or they were starting to have those types of conversations for the first time regarding gender dynamics and expectations in a relationship. And again, that's what I always love about it, is because I'm a selfish person. All of these stories are actually about me.
Yeah, of course.
All of them.
That's the point. They're supposed to attack you right there at your heart, at your mind. They're supposed to start conversations. You're supposed to think introspectively about, how do I fit in this story?
Yes.
And that's why I think you make such a good point, that monsters will, like, if anybody in the future ever, if aliens came down, right, and they were like, what is this 2023 all about? They'd look at these movies and these stories. Who were the bad guys? What did these main characters fear the most? And that's how you understand a humanity. That's how you understand a society. Mm. And I you mentioning the Barbie movie, I know there was like a lot of animosity towards this idea of women having autonomy and free will and independence and being their own person. And people were angry. Right. People were like, why can't you just be a Barbie movie? Why do we have to get political about it or whatever?
Right.
And it's like, well, Barbies just are inherently politicized. Like, they just are these walking bodies of femininity, but can be, there's misogyny there too. And it's very scary to look at yourself in the mirror. And society, I think, finds that out through storylines and monsters. Like the Invisible Man was, I mean, I walked out sobbing. Like, it was brilliant. It was terrifying. And I mean, again, the craziest part of it is you never saw the guy.
Right.
Once. Once. And it just goes to prove how far manipulation can go, how far gaslighting can go, how crazy you can feel when you don't see that monster right in front of you, but you know that there's something bad out there, right? And that's what's so brilliant about monstrosity. And I agree with you. I think it's constant. There will always be a different monster. There will always be a new way to look at a monster or a story. And I think that's why I love so much, like, the cultural role monsters have been taking, at least lately. They've always been there, but lately in pop culture.
Yeah.
Like Jordan Peele, right? Like,
yes.
Whoa. Like, the first time I saw Us, lost my mind. Absolutely lost my mind. I mean, it's stunning. It's brilliant. It's fascinating. It questions society. It questions you.
Well, and I think Get Out is a cultural touchstone now for us understanding a concept.
100%.
And that's something colloquially I hear a lot, is the sunken place, that people automatically understand a cultural dynamic in a unique way because they explored it through the safety of a horror film.
Yeah.
That way too, right? I'm able to reflect on my race and identity as I engage with these concepts in a safe way too. And so that's why I love monsters too. And like you said, they are how we explore our culture. They sometimes teach us the rules of our culture too, in terms of when we were talking about monstrosity as a behavior.
Yeah.
Great. Don't do this or Krampus will come and get you. Right? Like, Krampus, I think, is a great holiday. I mean, they made that to a horror film recently,
Of course they did.
But even that creature reflects, hey, he comes and gets the bad kids. Yeah. Okay, cool. That teaches me what my rules are of how to engage with that monster.
Yeah. It gives you a good gauge of how you should act in society. And again, that is very scary and haunting and reflexive in a way that may not always feel very comfortable.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point. That's where monsters are born, in uncomfortability. And I think that's where you can thrive too, are in places like that, you know? So great answer. Okay, Ben, last question, which may be silly and may be goofy, but it's my favorite question of the entire interview. You're in Alabama right now, right? So say one day, early in the morning, the Incredible Hulk knocks on your door, or knocks it down. I don't know. And boom, you're face to face with the Incredible Hulk. Or it could be Bruce, whatever you choose in this scenario.
Yeah.
What do you think you would say to them in that moment?
Ooh, that's great. I love playing. This is great. I think it would depend on who I'm talking to.
Okay.
I think if it were Bruce, it would be, can I help you? And that could be in any way. It is, hey, do you just need to stay here for a little bit? Can I get you some food? Can I help you lie low from the cops? There's whoever's after you right now. If I were talking to the Hulk, I think I would just ask him what he needs. And depending on the version of him, he might need different things. He might just say, I need to be left alone. He might say, I need you to listen to me. I need you to jump on my back and we'll go hit Las Vegas together. But I think, can I help and what do you need are the two things that I would offer, depending on who it is, because I like that it gives them autonomy in a way too. To be able to say, what can I do for you? Or what do you need separate of me that I can't do anything about? And even if it is that I can't do anything for them, then being able to articulate it and be like, cool, you got that out. And then maybe you can go back to
wherever you need to, whatever you need to be in that moment.
Well, have fun knocking down someone else's door.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's true Ben Pyle fashion. is to be, how are you today? How are you doing today? Right? It circles back, Ben.
Okay.
I just really, I'm so proud of you, and I'm so excited for like where you are in life, and like to be able to, I don't know, like when we were first talking about this stuff and these concepts, they were all concepts. They were all imaginary, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but like, I don't know, they were hard to obtain, and things you could only wish or dream about.
Right.
And I think it's exciting to see that you are putting these aspects of safe story into fruition with your students and also with yourself.
Yeah.
You know, like, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm so proud of you for saying I have anxiety.
Well, thanks.
Because that's hard. That is a really hard thing to say. And you're saying it and you're proud of it. And maybe not proud of it every day. It's hard to be, but you are.
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, a decade ago, I wouldn't have been able to say it. I wouldn't have been able to, actually, I didn't even know it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that I was terrified of, even the thought of me potentially having anxiety, right? Like I'm so scared of knowing that I have something that I couldn't confront it that way. But now I'm able to work with it and not judge it, and be able to understand and explore it more, and to then not spiral into a bad place emotionally, because I'm able to recognize, cool, is this the climate right now, or is it the weather? Right? The weather might be stormy temporarily, but it's going to pass. It's fine.
Yeah.
Versus, have I just been feeling this way for a long, protracted amount of time? Why is that? It gives me a way to be able to explore it either way, and to then find a path moving forward, and not just sitting in the unknown of it that way. And I'm just so proud of you. Again, thank you so much for having me on this. I'm selfishly just happy to just get a chance to chat with you about stuff like we always did. And that's what I think is the power of all of these stories too, is I think that's what connected us in a lot of ways. Our shared love of these stories and concepts and big things that way. And that's, I don't know, that's my pitch for everyone to pick up a comic or watch a series or whatever that way.
Be a Hulk.
Be a Hulk.
It's okay. It's not as scary as it may seem, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and produced by me, Camille Maria Acosta. And a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And thank you, Dr. Ben Pyle, for such a selfless interview. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show. It truly means everything to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. You can find us on our website and our socials, links in the descriptions as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.